Let me just end with the two main consequences, in my opinion, of the Goldstone report. The first is that it registers and catalyzes the breakup of liberal Jewish support for Israel. Mr. Goldstone is the quintessence of the classical liberal Jew, a renowned defender of the rule of law and human rights. And it's become more and more difficult, nearly impossible, for Jews or liberals, and most Jews are liberal. 80% of Jews voted for Barack Obama. Even Latinos, the percentage was 67%. If you factor in income, Jews should be voting overwhelmingly Republican. But Jews are liberal. And what does liberal mean? In the American context, it means belief in the rule of law, international institutions, belief in human rights. Amnesty International is a liberal organization. Human Rights Watch is a liberal organization. And it's become impossible for those who call themselves liberal, which is to say the overwhelming number of Jews, it's become impossible to defend Israeli conduct and call yourself a liberal. And that was no doubt Goldstone's own dilemma. It's highly unlikely, given his personal history, he was eager to condemn Israel, eager to call for Israel's being brought before the International Criminal Court. That's very unlikely. But he's also a liberal, a consistent one. And forced to choose, he applied the law. In recent years, more is known about the actual historical record. More is known about Israel's human rights record. More is known about Israel's diplomatic record. It's just not possible to defend that record any longer and call yourself liberal. And the Gaza Massacre was a turning point. It was, you might call it, the final descent into barbarism. Every other preceding war of Israel, it had both a military component, there was a battlefield engagement. 67 was really a turkey shoot, as Walt Rostow said at the time, but there was a military engagement. And there was, of course, a targeting of civilians. But in the case of Gaza, it was the first time there was no military component. It was just an outright, flagrant massacre. The second main consequence of the Goldstone report is that for the first time it's displaced, maybe only temporarily, but it's displaced the so-called peace process, the fatuous peace process, and moved the human rights dimension of the conflict to center stage. There's a lot to be said about the whole human rights record in Israel. Suffice it to say now, I could document it more fully during questions and answers. From around 1967 to about 1990, human rights organizations, there weren't that many back then, but the ones that existed, like Amnesty International, were very cautious about criticizing Israel for reasons both good and bad. The good reason was the special dispensation because of the suffering Jews endured during World War II. The bad reason being Jews are liberal, and they gave to liberal organizations, and liberal human rights organizations were fearful of the plug being pulled financially if they criticized Israel. After 1990, roughly during the first Intifada, human rights reporting became quite good, but the reports just collected dust. There are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of human rights reporting now on Israel and the occupied territories between 1990 and, say, the present. But nobody referred to it, nobody cited it, nobody actually, with rare exceptions, nobody even read it. But now the Goldstone report has moved center stage, and for the first time in the history of the conflict, the findings of human rights organizations have become politically consequential. And it's unsurprising then that now Israel and its supporters have embarked on a concerted campaign to discredit and defund these human rights organizations, and also to discredit and roll back the laws of war. It's a lamentable thing to have to say, and it's also true that, so far as I can tell, Harvard Law School is not part of the phenomenon, but many law schools and lawyers are now holding conferences and meetings with the express intent of trying to undo the laws of war on the grounds that democracies can't defend themselves against terrorism, and when you try to impose the laws of war on democracies, you are engaging, and this is the new term, you're engaging in lawfare. That is to say, not warfare, but using the law in order to undo the democracies. What should we do now? Gandhi, who I spent this past year reading quite a lot on, he has a very large collected works that runs to about 100 volumes, 500 pages each. Most of it is devoted to diet and home cures. It's true, now that I'm an independent scholar, I need an income, and so I was thinking about putting out a book called Going Gandhi, the Mahatma's Guide to Good Living, Good Diet, and Good Health. Now I know Cyrus is thinking, oh no. Oh yes. In any case, he called his doctrine of nonviolence satyagraha, which is translated as hold on to the truth. And I think that's useful, it's valuable advice. We have to hold on to the truth, that what Israel has done to the Palestinians is wrong, and it's indefensible. We have to hold on to the truth, that a diplomatic settlement of the conflict is within reach, that Israel's refusal, backed by the US, to respect international law has blocked such a peaceful resolution of the conflict. If we learn how to wield the weapon of truth, as it's recorded in the findings of the human rights community, and we learn how to wield the weapon of justice, as it's embodied in the uncontroversial principles of international law, if we learn how to wield the weapons of truth and justice and show a little fortitude, then I am convinced that a settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict is within reach. Thank you.
Can you hear me? So we have 35 minutes for comments and questions. Thank you very much for that. I am going to call on people. You'll have to speak up. Remember the guidelines. And I am going to limit questions to 2 minutes. Shannon, I can't make the stopwatch work, so I'm just going to use that clock up there. So this will be rough, and it may be a few seconds less or a few seconds more. Comments and both questions and comments are fine, but 2 minutes is a serious limit to how long you can speak. And I'll begin to harass you when it seems to me that you've spoken for 2 minutes. And I have a mic, and you won't have a mic. So let's see. Let me start over there. You have to speak up because it's a big room full of people.
Stand up.
It seems like more than a coincidence that the war in Gaza was just 2 weeks before the Bush administration left office. Do you see any connection between all? Is there any evidence at all?
No. I don't want to be a stickler for words, but I'm not going to call it a war because there was no war in Gaza. But I don't think there was a connection with the Bush administration leaving office. There was a connection with the end of the attack on Gaza, which was just before the Barack Obama inaugural, and presumably the message was transmitted, don't ruin my coronation. So that's probably likely. But Israel had begun the attack, plans for the attack on Gaza as early as March 2007. The Israeli papers reported that the only reason Ehud Barak entered into the ceasefire with Israel is it needed time to prepare the attack. And once the pieces were in place, all it needed was the pretext. And it waited, as most of you remember, it waited till November 4th, when the attention of everybody in the US was riveted on the results of the election. With everybody riveted on the results, that's when they invaded Gaza, killed 6 Palestinian militants, and ended the ceasefire. But that had, I don't think, much to do with Barack Obama, apart from the end. Or with Bush, apart from the end.
Yeah. Yes.
One is just for the benefit of the audience. I wondered if you could say what the population of Gaza is and the square miles of it, and then after that, if you wouldn't mind saying something about current events with what just happened with the settlements and declaration in East Jerusalem, and if the policy seems to be shifting at all in the U.S. Thanks.
I think the population of Gaza, it ranges, but most people put it about 1.5 million. Is that a fair estimate? And 360 square miles. Is that a 300 square kilometers? Roughly those are the figures. As to the most recent current events, I don't personally attach much importance to them. It's pretty similar to what happened between George Bush Sr. during the Bush-Baker years and Yitzhak Shamir when there was a $10 billion loan that was supposed to go to Israel, but Shamir had this kind of in-your-face style about expanding settlements like Netanyahu. He offended Bush and Baker, and they withheld the $10 billion loan. It's almost certain that because the U.S. withheld the loan, Israel put Mr. Shamir out of office. Rabin came into office, Yitzhak Rabin. In fact, settlements expanded at a much faster rate under Rabin than they did under Yitzhak Shamir. But the loan went through, and there was about $450 million deducted from the loan because of Israeli settlement expansion. But the U.S. didn't even count at that time, building in East Jerusalem as settlement expansion. The only point I would want to make was I suspect some people here are from the Harvard Law School community. I don't know how many. I can't recognize you by face, apart from the person standing next to me. Is that there's so much legal obfuscation about what's going on. So yesterday, I don't read her Isabel Kirshner. She's just, she's intolerable. But I did look at the headline, and she says, Israel is now building homes in East Jerusalem. And that was something, the headline was something like that. But a factually correct headline would have said, Israel building illegal homes in illegally annexed East Jerusalem. That's the record. And I don't want to, be absurd for me to try to pull rank on, eminent legal scholars, but these are not controversial issues in international law, and it's a complete falsehood to claim that they are. Let's just take the 2 cases that are most in the news now, the settlements and East Jerusalem. In July 2004, the highest judicial body in the world, the International Court of Justice, rendered an advisory opinion on the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories. And in the course of rendering an opinion on the legality of the wall, which it decided was illegal, it had to address many preliminary issues, prior issues, among them East Jerusalem and the settlements, those two issues which figure now so prominently in the news. What the ICJ found? Well, it found that under international law, and they're very clear, they say that the West Bank, comma, including East Jerusalem, is occupied Palestinian territory. The West Bank, comma, including East Jerusalem, is occupied Palestinian territory. It said that the settlements were, quoting the UN Security Council, a flagrant violation of international law. What was the vote in the ICJ? Well, you judge for yourself whether it was close. The vote was 14-1. On these particular issues, the issues of the settlements in East Jerusalem, there were no dissents registered. Thomas Bergenthal, he didn't actually write a dissent, he wrote what's called a separate opinion. And in his separate opinion, he did, not a separate, declaration, excuse me. He didn't write a dissent, he wrote a declaration. And in his declaration, where he went through point by point the places where he disagreed with the majority, he did not express any dissent on the question of East Jerusalem being occupied Palestinian territory. And furthermore, Mr. Bergenthal was very explicit. He says it is absolutely clear that under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the settlements are illegal. So on the question of the settlements, the vote was 15-0. But when you read the Times, as I did yesterday, they call these settlements, they don't call them settlements, they call these building projects contentious. There's nothing contentious about them. They are illegal under international law. And there are not claimants, well, there are claimants to East Jerusalem, but only one of those claimants has a legal title to them, and that's the Palestinians.
Let's see, I'm going to call on someone back there. Yeah, yes, you.
I have a practical question for you. We have a group west of Boston, and we're calling our reps and we're writing letters. Would you agree or would you disagree that one of the key issues is the money that the United States gives to Israel? And if we stop giving that money, could that go a long way toward the peace process? Is that something our group should be working on?
Well, first of all, just to come to the end of your question, you don't have to stop giving the money, you only have to threaten to stop, and the show would be over tomorrow. My general opinion is that the most prudent strategy to try to achieve a just and equitable settlement of the conflict is to use the tools of international law. And that bears directly on the question that you just raised. At the end of the attack on Gaza, Amnesty International put out a quite impressive report entitled Fueling Conflict. And in that report, it went through all the countries which are supplying Israel with weapons, and it's quite a substantial list. And Amnesty International made the following points. It said under international law, it's illegal to transfer weapons to a consistent violator of human rights, a country that's a consistent violator of human rights. And it said under domestic American law, it's illegal to transfer weapons to a country which is a consistent violator of human rights. And so Amnesty International called for a comprehensive total arms embargo on Israel and on Hamas. On Hamas, it's pretty meaningless. It's arms embargo on firecrackers and Roman candles. But in the case of Israel, it's quite significant. And that's the weapon we should be using. We should be saying that Amnesty International, not an ultra-left, not an extreme organization, the most respected human rights organization in the world, it's calling for a total cutoff of arms transfers to Israel. And I would have to say, I would highly recommend people read the Amnesty report, Fueling Conflict. They had a very compelling third statement. Number one, they said the U.S. is by far and away the chief supplier of weapons to Israel. Number two, under domestic U.S. law, it's illegal to transfer weapons. But number three, it said, and it was very, very compelling, Amnesty International said, what happened in Gaza could not have happened were it not for U.S. taxpayer money.